Louisiana, a place where the air itself hums with secrets, where jazz spills through the streets, but sometimes the music doesn't come from a trumpet. It comes from something buried beneath. Here, the nights are thick with fog and whispers. The bayous never sleep, the mansions never forget, and the dead, they never really leave. In the French Quarter, laughter echoes through crumbling balconies. Yet if you listen closely, you'll hear another sound beneath it. The faint murmur of the past, still clawing to be heard. Out in the swamps, ghostly brides still wander the waters, searching for lovers who drowned long ago. And in towns swallowed by moss and silence, voices rise from the ground, hymns from those who were never meant to rest. Tonight we're traveling deep into the heart of Louisiana, a place where beauty meets decay, and every shadow hides a story. These are the Louisiana horror stories, true echoes of terror that still linger in the dark. Pause. If you dare, stay until the end, because the deeper we go, the louder the dead begin to sing. There's a street in the heart of the French Quarter that most tourists walk past without ever noticing. Rue du Maine, narrow, cobblestoned, lined with iron balconies draped in vines that seem to never die. During the day, it's quiet, just the shuffle of feet and the hum of jazz echoing from somewhere blocks away. But at night, Rue du Maine breathes. Locals say the air there feels heavier. The street lamps flicker, and even the wind sounds like it's humming, a tune that doesn't quite belong to this world. The old building at number 47 stands out, shutters always half closed, candles flickering behind lace curtains. They say no one's lived there longer than a few months. But it always draws musicians, the kind of people who chase sound the way others chase ghosts. One of them was Elijah Broussard. He was a jazz pianist, 34 years old, with long fingers built for melody and eyes that looked like they'd seen too much. The year before, he'd lost everything. His home, his wife, and his baby girl, all gone in a fire that burned through the lower 9th Ward. One unseasonably cold January night, he survived by accident. He'd been playing at a club when it happened, and the guilt never left him. When the landlord handed him the keys to that Rue du Maine apartment, Elijah thought it was a second chance. This place, the landlord had said, has good bones. History in the walls. History. Elijah didn't know how much truth hid in that word. He moved in with nothing but his salvaged piano, the same one that once stood in the living room of his old home. Its wood was cracked, its varnish scarred, but when he touched the keys, the sound was still pure. The room where he placed, it had high ceilings and peeling wallpaper, patterned with faded fleur-de-lis. The windows overlooked the street, and at night, the glow of gas lamps cast soft golden halos on the cracked plaster. For the first few nights, it felt like peace. He'd play soft melodies until the early hours, letting the sound fill the hollow space that grief had carved inside him. He even started composing again, slow, mournful pieces full of longing. He said the music helped him forget. But then one night, the music answered him back. It was faint at first, a trumpet, distant and low, playing a familiar tune. He smiled, thinking someone downstairs was practicing. But the sound wasn't below him. It was above. He froze. There was no upstairs apartment, just the roof. He turned off his lamp and listened. A full band, trumpet, bass, brushed snare, and piano. His own melody, mirrored and perfected. The notes echoed through the ceiling, each one clearer than the last, like an invisible orchestra playing just out of sight. He laughed softly. Maybe it was the acoustics. Old buildings did strange things with sound. But when he stepped into the hallway, the music stopped. The silence that followed felt unnatural, like the world had been paused, holding its breath. He waited. Nothing. He returned to his room, and as soon as he sat at the piano, the trumpet began again. One long, mournful note. He stopped playing for the night. Over the next week, it continued. Always at midnight. Always that same phantom jazz band above him. Sometimes it was a single instrument. Other times, an entire ensemble, filling the air with rhythm and warmth. Then one night, Elijah decided to join in. He placed his hands on the keys and began playing along. The phantom music responded, swelling around him in harmony. It was beautiful, haunting, but alive. He felt something stirring in him, something like joy. Until he heard it. a voice between the notes, soft like a whisper through a gramophone. "You play beautifully, Elijah." He froze. The voice was close, right behind him. But when he turned, no one was there. The room was empty except for the flickering candle and his reflection in the window. His reflection, and behind it, the faint outline of another figure standing in the corner. He blinked and it was gone. He didn't sleep that night. The next morning, the piano keys were still depressed, as though an unseen hand had never left them. He tried to tell himself it was exhaustion. Maybe the stress, maybe grief. But then came the dreams. Each night he dreamed of smoke, of a woman singing in a silver dress, standing in front of a burning stage. Her voice, velvet smooth, wrapping around a single lyric he couldn't quite make out. And every morning, he'd wake up to find ashes on the floor near the piano. Elijah began asking around. He stopped by a small cafe near the square and mentioned his building. The old woman behind the counter stopped pouring coffee. "Rue du Maine?" she asked quietly. That house used to belong to the Lafleur family. Back in the 20s, they ran a jazz club out of their parlor. Best in the quarter. Folks came from all over to hear it. But one night, it burned. Some said the candles caught the drapes. Others said someone locked the doors. Nobody made it out. Only the music. She lowered her voice. They say it still plays, for anyone who listens long enough. Elijah didn't tell her about his own fire. He couldn't. That night, the whispers returned, louder now. He heard them in every corner of the apartment, behind the wallpaper, in the floorboards, beneath the piano lid. Sometimes it was laughter, sometimes weeping. Once he swore he heard a baby's cry fade into the sound of a trumpet. He began losing time, waking up hours later with his fingers raw, the piano playing by itself, the faint scent of smoke clinging to his clothes. The music grew darker, off-tempo, discordant, like a song unraveling itself. And beneath it, faint words murmured between every measure. Words he couldn't make out until one night when he pressed his ear to the piano lid and heard it clearly. "We never left." The lights flickered. The air thickened. The walls seemed to pulse with heat. Then came the knock. 3 soft taps at the door. He stood frozen, watching the handle slowly turn though no one was there. A draft swept through the room, extinguishing the candle. The piano began to play. He turned, and there she was. A woman in a silver gown, the one from his dreams. Her hair pinned up the way his wife once wore it. Her back faced him, her hands hovering just above the keys. The soft hum of a lullaby filled the air, a tune he hadn't heard since his daughter was alive. "Elijah," she whispered. "Play it again, for me." His throat tightened. He wanted to run, but his legs wouldn't move. When she turned toward him, her face was blackened, burned, her eyes hollow but glistening like melted glass. He stumbled back. "You're not her," he whispered. The figure tilted her head, and the piano struck a sharp chord by itself. Then another. The music built, chaotic, frantic, furious. The candle on the table flared back to life, burning blue. Smoke poured from the walls. The floorboards cracked beneath his feet. He could hear the band again. Trumpets, drums, voices, screaming instead of singing. The entire apartment shook as if the past itself was clawing its way out. He covered his ears, shouting, but the sound only grew louder. His last sight before everything went black was the woman stepping toward him, her mouth open in a soundless scream, eyes blazing with firelight. When the landlord came the next morning, the apartment door was locked from the inside. The piano sat in the corner, its surface still warm to the touch. 5 keys were pressed down, forming a perfect F minor chord. No sign of Elijah Broussard. The wallpaper had peeled back to reveal scorched wood. And written beneath it, in blackened soot, were 4 words. "We're still playing, Elijah. Sometimes, late at night, people walking past Rue du Maine swear they can hear a faint jazz melody drifting from the second floor, a song that shouldn't exist, played by hands that don't belong to the living. And if you listen too closely, the piano might just call your name." They say there are parts of Louisiana where the water never sleeps, where the cypress trees lean in too close, their roots like fingers reaching through the swamp, and the fog never lifts, not even when the sun rises. That's where the locals whisper about her. The woman in white, The Bayou Bride. It started as a story told by the old fishermen. Somewhere deep along the Atchafalaya basin, they'd spit tobacco into the water and say her name only once, quiet, almost afraid it might summon her. But for one man, she wasn't just a story. His name was Daniel Thibodeau. Daniel was 29, a wildlife photographer who had grown up in Lafayette but had spent most of his adult life running from the past. He'd just come back from New York, broke, divorced, and searching for something to give his life meaning again. He'd heard about the swamp, the way it seemed untouched by time, and he thought maybe, just maybe, he could capture something beautiful there. A redemption of sorts. When he arrived in the small parish town of Pierre-Part, he rented a tiny cabin near the edge of the bayou. The owner, an old Creole woman named Eulalie, handed him the key and said, "Don't go near the water after midnight. The bride walks then." He smiled, thinking it was just folklore. "Who's the bride?" he asked. Eulalie didn't look up from her rosary. She's the one who never made it to the altar. That night, the swamp was alive with sound, frogs croaking, crickets singing, and the low hum of something distant that Daniel couldn't quite place. He set up his tripod, pointed his lens toward the still water, and began shooting. He stayed out past midnight despite Eulalie's warning. The fog rolled in thicker, swallowing the moonlight until the world turned silver gray. That's when he saw it, a shape gliding across the bayou, too pale, too still to be human. He lifted his camera and zoomed in. A woman, dressed in white, her veil trailing behind her like mist. She didn't walk, she drifted. The water beneath her was untouched, perfectly smooth. He lowered the camera and she was gone. The next morning, he checked the photos on his laptop. Every frame was blank, nothing but static lines cutting across the image. But the audio file his camera had recorded was still intact. It was faint at first, just the sound of the night air. Then came the whisper, a woman's voice. "You saw me." He slammed the laptop shut. Later that day, he went back to town, asking around about the legend. Some laughed him off. Others crossed themselves and told him to leave it alone. Finally, an old trapper named Louis told him the full story. Back in 1923, Louis said, there was a plantation about 10 miles north. Belonged to the Duvernay family. Their daughter, Celeste, was set to marry a man from New Orleans, rich, polished, not one of us. But he never showed. They found his carriage turned over in the swamp, horses gone, driver dead. No sign of him. Celeste waited, and when the sun went down, she walked into the bayou wearing her wedding dress. Folks found her veil floating on the water the next morning, but her body never turned up. Some say she drowned, others say the bayou took her. Louis looked Daniel dead in the eyes, and she's still waiting. Every night, just before the fog rolls in. That night, Daniel couldn't stop thinking about her. He sat at his desk, staring at the dark window, the reflection of his lamp hovering like a ghost. The swamp was calling him, softly, like a heartbeat. He picked up his camera. By the time he reached the water, it was close to midnight. The fog crept low and thick, curling around his ankles. The cicadas had gone silent. The whole swamp seemed to be listening. He raised his camera again, and there she was. Closer this time. Her gown shimmered in the pale light, soaked but pristine, as though it existed in another time. Her face was hidden behind the veil. She tilted her head, and the movement was slow, deliberate. He stepped forward. "Who are you?" he whispered. Her voice drifted through the air, calm and melodic, like a lullaby carried by wind. "I've been waiting so long." He should have run. Every instinct told him to. But something about her voice, it pulled him closer, as if the swamp itself wanted him to step inside. The ground beneath him softened. His boots sank an inch, then another. The smell of decay rose up, sweet and thick, like rotting flowers. Her hand lifted the veil. Her face was gray, lips split, eyes black like the water. Deep, endless, hollow. She smiled. "Will you take my hand?" He stumbled back, nearly falling into the water. The world twisted, the trees bending inward, their branches stretching like arms. Her voice rose above the croaking frogs and whispering reeds. "Don't leave me again." The fog engulfed him. The next thing he knew, he was back in his cabin. Mud caked his shoes. His camera sat on the table, its lens cracked. He thought it had been a nightmare until he played back the footage. Static, then the same whisper, "You'll come back." He didn't sleep. He packed his things, ready to leave by dawn. But when he stepped outside, the fog was still there, heavy and unmoving, as though the swamp didn't want him to go. His car wouldn't start. His phone had no signal. And when he looked toward the bayou, he saw her again, standing at the water's edge, veil fluttering, her face turned toward him. Only this time, she wasn't alone. Behind her stood a dozen more figures, pale, silent, each in tattered clothing from different eras. Some in uniforms, some barefoot, some still clutching wedding flowers long rotted to dust. The swamp was full of them. He turned and ran inside, bolting the door. He didn't realize until he reached the mirror that his clothes were wet, soaked to the bone, as if he'd already stepped into the bayou. The floorboards creaked. He looked up. She was standing in the doorway, veil dripping, her hands folded over her chest. "You came back," she said softly. "Now you can stay." The next morning, Eulalie came by to check on him. She found the cabin door open, camera smashed on the ground, mud prints leading from the bed straight out to the water. They searched for him for 3 days, never found a trace. But a week later, one of the fishermen claimed he saw something floating. Beneath the cypress trees, a figure in white, holding a camera close to her chest, her veil trailing like smoke. And if you listen closely in that part of the swamp, you can still hear the faint sound of a shutter clicking, over and over again. There's an old chapel in the backwoods of St. Landry Parish. Most maps don't show it anymore. The road that once led there has been swallowed by the swamp, and the locals will tell you it's best to let it stay buried. They call it St. Augustine's Hollow, though there hasn't been a congregation there for nearly 70 years. The building still stands, barely. Half sunk, roof collapsed in places, bell tower leaning like a drunk man ready to fall. But every now and then, when the wind cuts through the pines just right, people swear they can hear something coming from that hollow. Not the wind, not the frogs, not even the cicadas. They say it's singing, and no one who's gone to hear it up close has ever been quite the same. Ore? His name was Reverend Samuel Greaves. He came to St. Landry Parish in the summer of 1953, a tall, soft-spoken preacher from Georgia with a passion for saving souls and a voice that could fill a room. He was young then, newly married, full of hope. When he arrived, St. Augustine's Chapel was already dying. The roof leaked. The choir had dwindled to 3 voices. The congregation was old, tired, and haunted by something no one would talk about. But Reverend Greaves believed in redemption. He said every place, no matter how cursed, could be made holy again. The first Sunday he preached, the pews were nearly empty. But when he sang the old hymns, the walls seemed to hum back. The sound was pure, too pure. It echoed long after he stopped singing, like someone else was carrying the notes for him. His wife Clara said she heard it too. "It's beautiful," she said one night, sitting by the oil lamp while he tuned the church organ, almost like the angels are joining in. But Samuel couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't angels. He started noticing things. When he'd walk through the chapel at dusk, he'd hear faint voices from the rafters, murmured prayers, broken songs. The floorboards near the altar were always damp, no matter how hot the days were. And sometimes, when he knelt to pray, the air grew cold enough to frost the windows. Still, he stayed. He told himself it was his duty to bring light into the darkness. Then came October. The parishioners began returning. People who hadn't stepped foot in that church in years suddenly showed up at his doorstep, asking when the next service would be. They said they'd heard the singing, soft, sweet hymns drifting from the chapel at midnight. But Reverend Greaves hadn't been there at midnight. He began locking the chapel doors, yet every morning they were found open. Candles lit, hymnals scattered across the pews. One morning, Clara woke to find Samuel standing barefoot in the yard, eyes open but blank, his mouth moving soundlessly. When she shook him, he gasped as if waking from a nightmare. "I heard them," he whispered. "The choir." She took his hand. "There's no choir anymore, Sam." But he only looked toward the chapel. "There is now." Then, a few nights later, he decided to prove it. He brought his tape recorder, one of those old reel-to-reel machines, and set it on the pulpit. Midnight came and the swamp outside went still. Even the frogs seemed to hold their breath. Then it began. Soft voices, hundreds of them, rising from the walls, the floor, the air itself. The sound was beautiful at first, warm and full, like 100 souls singing in perfect harmony. The melody was an old one, "Nearer, my God, to thee," but slower, darker. As the music swelled, the candles on the altar flickered and went out. He could still hear the singing, clearer now, right beside him. He turned toward the pews. They were full. Men, women, children, pale and translucent, their faces calm, mouths moving in perfect rhythm. Some wore tattered clothing from another century. Some had no eyes. A few knelt in the aisles, hands clasped in prayer. He tried to speak, but no sound came out. The music grew louder until it shook the walls. Then, as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The tape reels clicked to a stop. The church was empty again. He stumbled outside, gasping for air. The swamp mist had crept up to the steps, glowing faintly in the moonlight. From the water, he heard something, faint, like a child humming. The next morning, when he played back the recording, there was nothing, only static. But beneath it, if he turned the volume all the way up, he could hear something faint, a single voice whispering, "We never stopped singing." Ore? Over the next few weeks, Reverend Greaves changed. He stopped sleeping. He spent hours in the chapel, standing before the empty pews, listening. Clara said he barely spoke anymore, only hummed the hymns under his breath. One night she followed him. He didn't even notice her watching from the doorway as he stood at the pulpit, arms raised, tears streaming down his face. The church was glowing, faintly, like light trapped beneath the floorboards. And then she saw them too. Dozens of shadowy figures gathered around him, their voices blending into one perfect, terrible harmony. The sound was so beautiful it hurt to hear. But beneath it, beneath the melody, was something darker. The low groan of wood, the hiss of air through cracks, the whisper of something ancient and hungry. Clara screamed his name. The light vanished. The figures dissolved. Samuel turned toward her, eyes wide, pupils gone. "They're here," he whispered. "They want me to join them." She dragged him home that night, but by morning he was gone. Ore? The townsfolk found him 3 days later, deep in the swamp behind the chapel. He was standing knee-deep in the water, his body still, his mouth open as though mid-song. His eyes were gone, replaced by 2 small polished stones. When they buried him, the choir sang Amazing Grace. But halfway through, every light in the church went out, and a second set of voices joined in, from nowhere, everywhere, all at once. The graves around the chapel began to tremble. After that day, St. Augustine's was sealed for good. The doors chained, the grounds abandoned. But on still nights, when the wind moves just right, people swear they hear the hymns again, faint and hollow, like voices rising from deep beneath the water. They call it the hollow choir, and if you ever hear them while driving those back roads, if the music starts low, almost human, and grows louder as you slow down, don't stop, because those voices aren't singing to God anymore. They're calling for someone new to lead them. The people of Bayou Gula don't talk much about what lives in their swamps. They'll talk about gators and snakes and water that can swallow a man whole, but not the light, not the one that moves without sound. If you're driving through southern Louisiana after midnight, past the sugarcane fields and down that narrow stretch of levee road, you might see it, a lantern glowing faintly orange through the mist, drifting between the cypress trees like a ghostly firefly. It moves slow, steady, deliberate. And sometimes, if you're unlucky enough to stare too long, it starts moving toward you. Locals say that if you see that light, it's already seen you. Ore? It started more than a century ago. Back in 1902, Bayou Gula wasn't much more than a handful of wooden shacks and muddy roads. The levee workers lived hard, died young, and believed in things the church would never preach. That's when Thomas Beauregard came to town. He was a quiet man, tall and thin, with eyes the color of river silt and hands rough from labor. He'd fought in the flood cleanup upriver, lost everything, his wife, his farm, his land, and came south to start over. He kept to himself, walked to work before sunrise, and came home long after sunset, his lantern the only glow for miles. Folks said they'd see it bobbing between the trees, that slow and steady rhythm of his footsteps. Never too fast, never too slow. Thomas didn't believe in ghosts, but he respected the bayou. He said it had moods, like a living thing. When it was quiet, it was listening. When it was restless, something was coming. One night, while heading home late, Thomas stopped near a bend in the swamp where the fog hung thick as smoke. He heard humming, a woman's voice, low and mournful, rising from somewhere out in the water. He raised his lantern and called out, but the sound faded. When he reached the edge of the bank, he saw footprints, barefoot, small, pressed deep into the mud. They led straight into the water. The next morning, Thomas told the foreman about it. The man spat tobacco into the dirt and said, "Don't follow voices in the bayou, son. The dead'll sing you straight to hell." Thomas laughed it off. But that night he didn't sleep. He kept thinking about those footprints, how fresh they'd looked, how the mud still glistened. Then came the flood. It rained for 3 days straight. The levee cracked, and a wall of black water tore through Bayou Gula, sweeping away homes, barns, and people alike. The screams carried for miles. When the waters receded, they found splintered houses, drowned cattle, bodies tangled in tree roots. But Thomas Beauregard was gone. Only his lantern remained, still burning, floating upright in the dark water. The priest called it a miracle. The locals called it a warning. For a while, nobody spoke his name. But then the sightings began. Hunters would whisper of a light gliding through the fog, always at chest height, moving deeper into the trees. Fishermen said it would appear just before sunrise, hovering above the water like a will-o'-the-wisp. When you called out, it would stop, and if you took one step closer, it would turn. A man named Eli Moran followed it once. He was drunk, bragging to his friends that he'd catch the damn ghost and sell the lantern for whiskey money. They found him 2 days later, sitting on the levee road with his clothes soaked and his skin pale as wax. He wouldn't stop mumbling. "They're down there," he said. "The ones the water took. He found them all. They're still singing." Eli never spoke again, died that night in his sleep. Decades passed. The world changed. The roads paved. The houses modernized. But the swamp didn't care. People still vanished near the levee road. In the 1950s, a couple on their honeymoon drove out there after dark. Locals told them to stay away. But they laughed. "City folks don't scare easy," they said. They were found the next morning. The car was idling, headlights still on, doors open, their belongings untouched. On the windshield, drawn with river mud, was a symbol, a crude lantern with a crooked handle. Their bodies were never recovered. Then there's the footage. In 1987, a group of college students from Baton Rouge decided to film a swamp ghost hunt for fun. The tape begins with laughter, beer cans clinking, flashlights bouncing in the dark. Then the mood changes. Someone says, "Do y'all see that?" The camera jerks toward the tree line, a faint orange glow swaying between the cypress trunks. The boy holding the camera starts walking toward it, calling out. The others beg him to stop. The light vanishes, the sound cuts, and the final frame shows nothing but fog. The police found their boat 2 days later, empty, tied to a tree. The camera was floating nearby, lens cracked. The stories all tell the same thing. Thomas's lantern still burns. It's said the swamp took him and made him its guardian, or its prisoner. They call him Lantern Man, the keeper of the drowned. Some say he searches for lost souls, trying to guide them home. Others believe he's collecting them, one light for every life the water claimed. Whatever the truth, those who see his lantern rarely forget it. In 2015, a wildlife photographer named Cameron Walsh came to Bayou Gula. He wanted to document nocturnal wildlife, owls, alligators, fireflies. He didn't believe in ghost tales, said they were just stories meant to sell gas station souvenirs. The first 2 nights went fine, but on the third, his motion cameras picked up something strange. A light moving slowly through the fog. It wasn't fire. It wasn't reflection. It moved with intent. Cameron rewound the footage again and again. Each time, the light seemed to come closer. At 2:37 a.m., his audio recorder picked up faint humming, old-fashioned, rhythmic, almost like a hymn. He went out to look. The mist swallowed everything, the trees, the stars, even the sound of his boots. Then he saw it. The lantern, hanging mid-air, glowing orange, and behind it, a man. His skin was pale and swollen, water dripping from his fingers. His clothes were tattered, covered in river silt. And his face looked like it hadn't drawn breath in 100 years. Cameron whispered, "Thomas?" The figure lifted the lantern higher. The flame flickered once, twice, and then exploded into a blinding light. The camera went dark. The next morning, the Rangers found Cameron's camp abandoned. His camera was on, recording nothing but static. And in the background, for just a second, you can hear that same humming, growing softer, then fading away. They never found his body. Ore? To this day, the people of Bayou Gula say that when the fog rolls in thick and the air grows still, you can see the light again. Some nights, there's only one. Other nights, there are two. Those who've seen it up close describe the same thing, that terrible stillness right before the swamp goes silent. The frogs stop. The crickets stop. Even the wind holds its breath. Then the light moves, closer, and from somewhere in the dark water comes a single whisper. Soft, trembling and full of sorrow. Come home. Ore? If you ever drive through Bayou Gula and see a lantern swaying in the trees, don't stop, don't look, and whatever you do, don't follow the light. Because once Lantern Man finds you, the swamp will keep your secret forever. And that brings us to the end of our Louisiana horrors. From haunted mansions to ghosts that still wander the bayou, the shadows here never really fade. But tell me, where do you think we're going next? I'll give you a hint. The next state is known for dark mines, old forests, and something buried deep that was never meant to be found. Drop your guesses in the comments. I'll be reading them. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, because the next story is already waiting in the dark. See you soon.